I'm Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. I am absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to this symposium on the niche, obscure topic of rethinking the global order. Just as a reminder, Dr. Klass's mission is to foster, expand, and leverage Harvard's research, educational, and convening capabilities within Latin America. We aim to contribute, and listen for this, to a more informed, democratic, sustainable, prosperous, equitable, and inclusive world. Whew, good luck with that. But the symposium, I think, is an excellent example of the kind of forward-looking conversations that we aspire to have in and about Latin America. I want to start by extending a special greeting to some of our distinguished guests, leading off with Alejandro Ramirez Magaña, who is the chair of our advisory board at Dr. Klass. I also want to extend a welcome to the other members of our advisory board who are here. We are thrilled to have you with us. I want to welcome Mark Elliott, the vice provost for international affairs at Harvard. And I want to give a really heartfelt gratitude to our multiple co-sponsors, to the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, for the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and a special thanks to our amazing Dr. Klass staff, particularly Gisela Zambrano, Vanessa Salas, and our great executive director, Sol Carbonell. Gisela, Vanessa, and Sol made this thing happen. It is difficult to overstate the relevance of today's topic, and I'm not going to talk much about it. As China continues its ascent into global superpower status, its economic, its geopolitical, eventually its cultural impact in Latin America will inevitably continue to grow. That we have known for a while, we've begun to study it seriously for a while. What's newer and what's less clear, I think, is the future of the United States' role in Latin America. The United States is no longer the global hegemon it was 30 years ago, and as it declines, its foreign policy has grown increasingly erratic. The Trump administration, I think it's fair to say, has been extraordinarily reckless in its use of military and economic power. It has strained Western alliances. It has violated international norms and international law. It has accelerated the unraveling of the liberal international order that the United States itself constructed after World War II. I personally, not an expert on this, but I personally do not think that the so-called Dunroe Doctrine is going to amount to very much over time. But in the short run, it represents a dramatic change in the United States' U.S. government's attitude toward Latin America, one that in many ways harkens back to the era of gunboat diplomacy in Venezuela, in Cuba, possibly in Panama and elsewhere. The Trump administration seeks to exert a kind of neo-colonial power that we have not seen in a century. And this at a time that democracy in the United States is in crisis. In its latest annual report on the global state of democracy, Freedom House scored the United States, and I think accurately, scored the United States as less democratic than Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Panama, and Belize, for good measure. So needless to say, these changes, both on the more gradual change on the Chinese side, on more disruptive on the U.S. side, have been a lot for Latin American governments to respond to. And my hope is that our conversation today can help us better understand a little bit the implications of the United States and China's growing presence or changing presence in Latin America. That's all I'm going to say. I am now very honored to introduce two outstanding leaders, our keynote speaker, Mariano Florentino Cuéllar, Tino, and our panel moderator, Marisol Argueta. Tino Cuéllar is president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Born in Matamoros, Mexico, he graduated from Harvard College a few years ago, then Yale Law School, then got his PhD in political science at Stanford University. He served for 7 years as a Supreme Court justice on the California State Supreme Court, was a professor at Stanford University where he taught law, international affairs, and political science. And if that's not enough for you, he held positions in the Clinton Obama, and Biden administrations. Tino's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He serves on the boards of Harvard University, Inflection AI, and Law Zero. And he's a trustee of the Anthropic Long-Term Benefit Trust. Tino, I want to welcome you to this podium. And after your address, hopefully we'll have time for a little bit of some questions.
Thank you, Steve. Buenos dias. It's great to see everybody here. I want to give you a little context for why it's such an honor to be here at Dr. Class with you. I was an undergraduate here, and the building was not here, this building, but I used to hang out at the Center for International Affairs, as we used to call it, and look for lectures and talks about Latin America. And when Dr. Class was created, I felt great happiness and excitement. I felt it was a great and important step for Harvard and for Latin America, which is where I grew up. And so I told my son, who's 19 years old, I said, did you ever think in your wildest dreams that I would be speaking at a celebration for the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies? And he said, Dad, neither you nor the David Rockefeller Center are in my wildest dreams. I'm glad I didn't ask my wife. But this is a son who holds me accountable. He says to me, I don't think that I can explain to my high school friends what you do. Can you explain it to me without using the word institution? And then he said to me, can you even talk and say anything without using the word institution, like for 10 minutes? And I think I will fail that task. But dreams, wildest dreams. I want to start by talking to you about dreams because we have them always around us and we carry them inside us. And in some ways, there is more talent on Latin American studies and more frontline knowledge about it than I have, to be honest. I care deeply about the region. I still have a lot of family there. I grew up there. But in many occasions in the last few decades, I've been pulled in different directions. What I can do with a lot of humility is give you maybe a little bit of how I see the context globally for what is happening in and around Latin America, and maybe a little bit some provocations about how, as somebody who cares about the region and tries to follow certain things that happen in the region, how I see some of the challenges ahead. But I defer to a lot of the expertise in this room. But I start with dreams because I want to be honest. The world that brought me to this country was a world where my parents and my family dreamed that we could have a better life here than we might in Mexico. And in part, it was because we were responding not only to the many things we loved about the country where I was born, but the many difficulties. And by the time I was an undergraduate here, the Berlin Wall had fallen. And Mexico itself looked like it was headed in a better direction. There was multi-party democracy that was developing. I remember Rufo Juan in the governorship in Baja California, and that foreshadowed a direction that suggested more democracy. And that suggested, if you think about the prevailing theories back then about modernization and about the intersection of politics and economics, the idea that there would be more economic growth, more democracy, more institutionalization, that all these things would in some ways go together. And it was not difficult. We were in classrooms like this one, maybe not quite as pretty, reading Frank Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man. And it was not difficult to imagine that so many of these trends would create a very different world. A world we could already see the outlines of, one where markets were well run and functioning, but they provided more opportunity to people around the world, where democracy was not just a paper guarantee, but it was a real thing, where people could hold their governments accountable, and where that wave, in effect, would not only go to Eastern Europe and to Central Asia and to Southeast Asia, but would actually be a huge part of the story in Latin America. Fast forward. The crux of my talk is effectively that that's not the world we are living in. And I want to be clear, my colleague Frank Fukuyama, who's now a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, at my institution, he would point out that his argument was often misunderstood. He was not suggesting that the end of history and the rise of markets and democracy and the twin relationship between them would create simply a better world that would make everybody happy. He was pointing out that as that seemed to be coming true, there would be other problems. People would be wondering, like, what gives them meaning? What's the point of life if we've settled these hard and difficult questions? So he was not suggesting that everything would be easy. But I think it's fair to say that the setup to the final question he got to in the book did assume a kind of, I wouldn't say teleological development, but a direction for the world that has been harder to achieve. And I want to pause for a moment and ask why. In many ways, these themes are very familiar to all of you, but it's worth unpacking them. But before I unpack them, I also want to recognize that Frank Fukuyama was not completely wrong. We were in the 1990s living in a world that was so much better from the world my parents were born into in Matamoros, and it was a world of longer lifespans and a world where girls had more in education, and it was a world where people had more wealth and more health. And if I fast forward from the 1990s to the present, there are some trends that have indeed continued. Life expectancy was 46 years old around the world in 1950. It's about 73 years now. We're living in a world where about 84% of women have an opportunity to read, when it was about 57% in the 1950s. We're living in a world that got to a point where there were 70,300 nuclear warheads, and now we have about 12,000. Still way, way too many. And Argentina, interestingly, is one of the very few countries in the world that went very, very close to developing a nuclear weapon and did not go through with it, and gives us some sense of how the nuclear story does implicate Latin America as well. But it is not hard to see and show how the more optimistic version of the world we imagined in the 1990s has not materialized. I can talk about the war raging in Iran. I can talk about the aggressive invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I can talk about the real dissolution of effectively what was a kind of partnership between China and the United States that structured much of the world economy. So in that kind of world, we face the reality that some of the challenges that have brought about the difficulties we face, with lower trust in government, with war, not just Cold War, but hot war, with fragmentation geopolitically, with the kind of pulling apart of the economic cooperation assumptions we made about trade and capital movements. We need to ask why, and we need to understand that many of the reasons why we ended up in this kind of world are not purely because certain people get elected to certain offices. And they're not purely the result of one country, the US or China or any country, or Russia, doing its thing or their things. Instead, the thicket of causation is complicated. There's a lot of expertise and knowledge here in this room about it, but I'll highlight a couple of forces that feel pretty important to me. Technology. So part of what has progressed from the 1990s is that we carry little supercomputers in our pockets that used to take almost a room to structure and function, and now we carry them around in our pockets. Many good things come from this. I don't have to wait for a taxi very long. On the other hand, the reality is that the way we consume information, and ultimately even the way the brain is structured, is beginning to be shaped by these devices. That in turn feeds into secular declines in trust for institutions, which in turn feeds into the reality that the institutions and norms that we thought would hold the world together were always probably too optimistically narrated. They were never quite as secure as perhaps the most articulate defenders of them would describe them as being. That's another way of admitting that whether you look at Latin America or whether you look at the rest of the world, the US may have been propping up the institutions, there goes that word, that were effectively allowing the world to cooperate. But it was never the case that the US was living up to its own promises, quite literally. Mark Carney said as much in Davos. And then you have the reality that as people lose trust in institutions, polarization becomes a bigger and bigger feature of democracies. And the trends that had made even authoritarian countries become more and more interested in consultation and public participation began to reverse. Let me highlight that for a second, because China is a very interesting example of this. In the 1990s and the 2000s, China understood it had a giant problem with environmental protection, and it turned to Western democratic methods of participation so local communities could participate and shape the agenda around environmental protection. But the combination of the discrediting of democracy and also the rise of technology and surveillance makes those methods less important for China. And so we're living in a very different world. What does that world mean for us now? I want to highlight 4 questions and then just map them onto Latin America a little bit as a provocation. To my mind, if you want to get a picture of where the world is going in the next 20, 30 years, you have to grapple with at least these 4 questions. Maybe there are more, and we'll talk about it. But number 1, can China and the US actually truly decouple? I think the answer is basically no, but it's important to understand why. China holds about $700 billion of US treasuries. Now, it's true that amount is declining and China's hedging, which Latin America is doing too. But I think that the basic reality of that much concentrated economic connection to the US makes it very, very hard to indulge the total decoupling fantasies. We can talk about rare earths. China controls about 90% of the processing of them. So even very ambitious efforts to decouple the US and the Chinese economy are going to leave American policymakers with a dilemma and a problem. And that is how to compete fiercely and intensely with China, but at the same time deal with the reality that complete disconnect is very, very likely a mirage. Plus, the challenges that I've alluded to, nuclear weapons, governing AI, climate, geopolitical security, not possible to likely deal with them too effectively without some line of communication between China and the United States. That's why at Carnegie we continue to have track 2 dialogues in the background quietly to keep those connections going. 2, where is the future of the international economic system going? And the answer is it's probably not going ever back to what it was like in the 1990s. The backlash to globalization is too intense in rich countries, in poor countries, and countries like Latin America that are stuck in some ways in the middle income trap. So the challenge is then how to build something that is a credible system for trade and capital movements that isn't quite as intrusive as what was common in the 1990s, but will allow a little bit more of an understanding of how countries can cooperate. The Carney Middle Power speech in Davos was very much about this in some ways. To what extent can these countries cooperate enough that they can find ways to build thinner trading systems that do hold countries accountable and facilitate coordination, but don't go back to the 1990s? 3, how will the US actually engage with the world? And this is where it's important to remember that notwithstanding Steve's very good points about the concerns we ought to have about what's playing out in the United States, in some ways, the US is still very much a democracy, I would argue, and that means public opinion matters. And what does public opinion tell us? It tells us that the kind of globalized engagement the US had 30, 40 years ago was not super popular. The wars in the Middle East are not super popular, but pulling back from the world completely is also not super popular. So leaving aside the war in Iran, the real question is, what's the balance the US is going to find that allows it to be perhaps more transactional, and you can probably expect that from both parties, but at the same time, not quite as aggressive and not quite as quick to impose costs on American consumers by disrupting trade. Finally, the biggest issue, and one most relevant to Latin America, I would say, is like, what do we do about the broader context that drives all of this, which is failures of domestic governance? I think it's fair to say that the loss of trust in institutions has not been the only issue. It's also been that there's an ossification that often plays out in democracy. Take my home state of California. There were plenty of legal cases that would remind us that it could easily take 20 years or longer to settle the question of whether you could use a parking lot to build dorms or housing for faculty in a community college, for example. That's not a good way of persuading countries around the world that democracy is a great system, right? And I would say California has the rule of law. California is one of the most innovative economies in the world, maybe the most innovative. And yet even there are plenty of problems with democracy. It requires a constant clearing of underbrush that even in the best of circumstances is difficult to pull off. But I can cast my gaze on authoritarian regimes, on countries around the world, and I would basically say this is my thesis. You're welcome to tell me that maybe you see it differently. And that is that if you leave aside small countries like Singapore, Denmark, and Finland, no country at scale knows how to govern right now, really effectively. Solving public problems effectively, building infrastructure effectively, but also not being overly coercive and having the rule of law work effectively. That's not an excuse for failures of governance, but it's just a reality to it. So let me close by turning more specifically to what I see playing out as important challenges in Latin America. And I'll be very surprised if any of this is unfamiliar or surprising to you. I'm just putting into words perhaps what many of you are thinking and feeling, or at least some of what is on the table. First, the reality is that Latin America has faced the pressure to hedge its bets and have complex relationships with the United States well before many other parts of the world, including Europe. If I go to a conference about security in Europe, what I hear is, we're surprised the US doesn't live up to its promises all the time now. We're concerned about the extent to which it might be sort of encroaching on really our sovereignty. And I would simply say, for many of us Americans who believe and welcome that the US be quite engaged with Latin America, it's still not surprising at all that these are complicated relationships. That in some parts of Latin America, you can hear the saying, poor country of mine, so far from God and so close to the United States of America. And that's not to say that Latin America doesn't always benefit in some ways from the geography, but the relationship with the US will be complicated, and it will push many big economies in Latin America to be close to Europe, and crucially, to think hard about how to balance the pressure they'll feel from the US around China with the very sensible and consumer and commercial and geopolitical reasons that it might have to continue to engage with China. Example, my colleague Oliver Stunkel, who is one of our star Latin America specialists at Carnegie, points out that trade between Latin America and China was $12 billion in 2000, and now it's $500 billion. It's true. I mean, some of these are trends that have played out all over the world, but that is to say, I think the pressure that Mexico is under to impose tariffs on some Chinese goods probably is not going to play out quite the same way everywhere. Second, the reality is that the state in Latin America, as in some other parts of the world, including Central Asia, does not have a monopoly on the use of force. And we'll see, where or if it ever does. These challenges highlight that the non-state actor issue, criminal organizations, transnational networks that do both legal and unlawful business are going to be a huge part of the conversation about where Latin America goes, what happens with it, what its future is like, and hard questions for people who govern about how they titrate accountability and the rule of law and making sure there's not impunity, but at the same time not getting pulled into conflicts that they don't quite know where they're going to go is going to be a big part of the conversation in Latin America. 3, for those of us who care about democracy, we have to recognize that in addition to secular trends and economic disappointments and dislocation, the security issue is very much a democracy issue in 2 ways, right? One is that awfully difficult to be a candidate in some Latin American countries at the local level and to speak your mind and to say what you really think, or a reporter, and not face real fear that something will happen to you or your family. That's not a pretty picture. I mean, the parts of the country that I come from in Mexico are familiar with that dynamic, and one does see change and movement in places like Colombia and places like parts of Mexico, but that reality highlights the extent to which the democracy conversation is entangled with security. The other way in which that entanglement plays out, of course, is the conversation about El Salvador and its model today, and the extent to which the consistent and persistent challenges with security push so many Latin Americans to ask, how much is some kind of formal democracy valuable to me if I can't keep my family safe? And how are these paper guarantees important and relevant to me? When in fact, it seems like in El Salvador, there's a way to deal with it. And if I'm sitting in Costa Rica, or if I'm sitting in other parts of the region, do I feel like maybe I would like some of what El Salvador has? Those are the challenges. They're not unfamiliar to you. I don't have easy, straightforward solutions. I'll just add maybe one last thing in closing. I do think it's interesting to note that in the 1990s, there was a simpler story about how economics was supposed to work, both globally and domestically. That there was a kind of straightforward model for development, that it was fairly, relatively speaking, unregulated, that it involved relatively lower level activity in states, which of course always was a way of dealing with corruption too. If you expand the public sector, you have to deal with the persistent corruption problems in places like Latin America and Southeast Asia. But if I can be a little historical, I'll just note that I don't think history bears out that 1990s model was ever really that successful. And I say that as somebody who believes strongly in the market. But I'd point out that the stories in Southeast Asia that are most dynamic and successful, and in East Asia and in other parts of the world, tend to involve a more complex story. One that involves markets, but also policing of markets, also targeted public investment, and then of course human capital investment in education and health, which is why the corruption issue is so real and so important to people. So I think part of our conversation is not only state capacity, questions involving security and democracy. It's also ultimately what's the right economic model. And here an important part of the story is going to be the extent to which critical minerals, the ones that lead to some of the rare earth role of China, are so well represented in some Latin American countries and give a real opportunity to ask a question of like, what's the development model to take good advantage of those resources, but also upskill the countries that are ultimately the ones where these are mined. I close with a quote from Francis Bacon, who's he's written many things, but I think the point ultimately is that we have a road to follow, and that road does require some choices, but it also requires some attention to what is the geography that that road is going to be built on, what are the materials we can use. And Bacon had this way of summing up the need for some pragmatism, but also dreams, which is what I started with. He would write and say that nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. And I think that's ultimately the challenge, making sure we take seriously what the real constraints are, but not letting that completely stop our dreams and hopes for the region. And as Forrest Gump would say, that's all I have to say about it. Thank you. When I was in the court, I would say to people, dissenting opinions, concurrence, questions?
Take 10 minutes or so
Okay.
questions.
Okay. I see my, okay, all right. My friend over here. There's a mic, yeah.
I'm surprised you didn't mention technology and artificial intelligence in the challenges, opportunities for the world and the region. You pretty much focus on other issues. Can you talk a little bit about how artificial intelligence is going to play in this whole equation?
Yeah, sure. It's a subject I love to talk about because there's a lot to say about it. But I will note that the connection between AI and the things I did mention should also be teased out. For example, I think the competition between China and the US on frontier AI is built on a model where they're interdependent in effect. Where, I mean, think about TSMC manufacturing the most advanced NVIDIA chips in Taiwan, right? Which is, you know, even the US agrees that Taiwan and China are one single jurisdiction. You've got Chinese origin talent that has come to the US as immigrants that are key in these frontier labs. You have Chinese companies buying up American chips. And ultimately you have this rare earth thing, which is not disconnected to the frontier hardware. But I think the bigger interesting question here, let me connect AI to two of the themes I highlighted. One is economic. So the backlash to globalization, which plays a big role in my talk, should make us really think hard about what happens if countries, whether they're developing countries or advanced industrialized countries, do not have a narrative, a story that they can plausibly tell about how technological change is going to affect their populations. So if I think, for example, about what is happening in interest in AI in the US, where there's greater and greater anxiety about data centers, about jobs, about kids having relationships with these models, I think it is ultimately an indication that there are some lessons from the globalization discussion that we might bring and take seriously. And that includes, to my mind, asking about what the economic model is going to be in 20 years, let's say, that allows us to take advantage of the technology but still have people happily employed and productive, and what's human and what's not. The second way in which there's a connection is around government performance. So I'll just talk for a second about India. I think the most interesting thing that Modi has done, and I'm not suggesting I agree with everything that has come in that government, but the Digital Public Infrastructure Initiative, which has allowed India to basically bring a digital identity and digital services to over 1 billion people, and to give them access to banking that they didn't have otherwise, and to direct government services without going through so many intermediaries. To me, that's a kind of example of the potential for AI to restructure some provision of government services. And some of the problems I described in California, which ironically is where this technology is often being developed, could lead to the state government piloting more integration of the technology and interactions with the public, which I think would make a lot of people happy. We still have 6 minutes and 36 seconds. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. As someone from Latin America, I am from Mexico, I perceive that there is a declining interest in Latin America and in Mexico over the past 3 decades. So despite the relevance of the region, at least in the US, the importance and the attractiveness of the region is declining, and you are aware of that as president of the Carnegie Endowment. Less think tanks spend resources studying the region. Even at Harvard, I mean, despite the important role played by Dr. Klaas, in general, you see that students don't pay much attention to the region. So how can we rediscover the importance of the region? I mean, if we want to improve things in the region, I think we need more attention to the region. So what is your perception on this?
I've often been frustrated by how much there is interest in high-level policymakers and in the private sector too, in the Indo-Pacific, let's say, in developing tech partnerships with India, and not so much in Latin America. So I agree with the premise. I would say at Carnegie, we take this pretty seriously. So we're very lucky that Andrew O'Donoghue, who's here in the audience, is going to be joining us at Carnegie. And he's an expert in many things, but among other things, the dynamics of democracy in Latin America. We have Oliver Stunkel. We have Alejandro Ramirez on our board of trustees. But we must do more. And to me, there are probably 2 parts of the story that will help. One is to highlight the extent to which this balance between competition and accommodation with China is going to run so heavily through Latin America. Effectively, if the US wants to decouple to some greater extent from China, then integrated supply chains in the Western Hemisphere are like the way to do it, in effect. But then also, to the extent the US wants to be pragmatic and thoughtful about the long term and balance short-term headlines with the longer-term strategy, some degree of understanding of the Chinese role in Latin America. I mean, this sort of the distinction one might draw between what infrastructure investments the Chinese have made that matter more to them and what investments they made that matter less to them. So that port in Peru, for example, strikes me as more important to them. How to strike that balance. So if you care about China and if you care about geopolitics, you have to care about Latin America. Second, more fundamentally, if I do look at the issues that so many Americans care greatly about, immigration, economic development, the well-being of the country more generally, they run through Latin America. So I think there's an opportunity. I would add a third. I've been struck by the cultural soft power of South Korea that makes it punch greatly above its weight. We have such incredible cultural riches in Latin America in different ways. And they go beyond tourism. They're really about trying to shape the narrative about what is the most interesting or dynamic way of experiencing the world and how does that relate to everything from food to music. And I think it'll be interesting to see where and how some creativity in that sector has an impact. Yeah, over here.
Just building on that, by the way, terrific presentation. Thank you so very much. Incredible. In that vein, doesn't it a little bit Latin America become the center with the Trump administration saying the new world order will have America for the Americas and we will see more Latin America? Careful what we want for, right? Like we wish for that, like a little bit of that.
Can I expand on that point? So I would say, I think another theme that I was trying to get across in my talk is there's so much to say about this administration in this moment that we ought not to lose the longer term reality. And longer term, I think you've been so right that mostly Latin America has been not the center of attention in the US geopolitically to the extent that it might be. But shorter term, you're right that this administration has a deputy secretary who was a Latin America kind of focused person and has turned a lot of geopolitical attention and moved an aircraft carrier into the Caribbean. And I do think in the course of my career, if you ask me, what is the relationship between attention on an issue and good policy? I would say it really depends on the issue. It's not a linear relationship for every issue. There are some issues like criminal justice and, let's say, migration and some aspects of technology policy where widespread public attention does not always bring you better policy. And then there are other issues like food safety and public health and pandemic preparedness, where the more public attention you get, actually, the better it is. So you're right. I think another way to put it might be, what is the narrative that we think would be most beneficial for the United States and Latin America that will help guide the attention that does come? And I think that one is one that relies more on the concept of partnership than the concept of control and coercion. And to me, that is really about benefiting Americans at the end of the day. It's about trying to keep the hemisphere secure and safe, learning from each other, and effectively playing a role in the world and being able to shape that world. Maybe one last question?
Hello. I want to build on Julio's question and your answer about India. All this AI and digitalization, it's great to include people in the financial system and all of that, but what about the government surveillance and the privacy of the citizens? Like in Germany, most of the people don't use credit cards because they don't want to be surveilled by the government. And what about in these authoritarian countries? What do you think about that?
I think it's a very good question, and ultimately the answer to me is that one of the saddest things about countries that are hurt by a lack of state capacity, and I include pretty much almost every country in Latin America, is that sometimes that lack of state capacity reflects a genuine and honest and fair distrust of the government. Let's say, what is the percentage of GDP in Mexico that is public? It's 18%. I think Mexico would be better off if it were higher. But I think a fair question is, well, what would Mexico do with that money? Where would it go? What would it be used for? And what if, the government had sort of more capacity to sort of enforce tax? So would that be used fairly? So in a way that the state capacity issue is absolutely wrapped up with questions about the rule of law. And I think in India, the story is complex. India has a fairly independent court sector. You can go back to Indira Gandhi and see that, but it is a slow and plodding court sector at times. It also, I think, has some safeguards that reflect the real power of civil society and some of the private sector there. But I think it's also fair to note that trust can be hard to come by, even in places like India. And so in the end, it feels to me like both of these things need to be built up at the same time. But I at least want to be honest that without solving the state capacity issue, I see a lot of challenges for Latin America. And I've been told that we're at time. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tino. 7. I think you mentioned institutions 7 times. Not too bad. I now want to introduce our moderator for our panel today. Marisol Argueta de Varillas, a lawyer and diplomat, is a senior director, head of Latin America, and member of the executive committee of the World Economic Forum. She holds a JD from La Universidad de José M. Delgado and a master's degree in diplomacy from Oxford. She pursued specialized studies at the International Peace Academy, Harvard, and the Wharton School. Marisol has served in several important diplomatic roles in El Salvador, including Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Representative to the United Nations. She's also a member of the Aspen Institute's Central American Leadership Initiative, and we are very, very proud to have her as a member of the Dr. Class Advisory Board. Marisol will introduce the panelists and afterwards take questions.
Thank you, Stephen, for your very kind introduction and for inviting me to moderate this panel on Latin America, the US, and China, aimed at transforming economic and political paradigms. It is a great privilege for me to be joined today by Professor Mark Wu. He is the director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University and the Henry Stimson Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Pedro Henrique Batista Barbosa, a distinguished Brazilian diplomat with the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Itamaraty. My dear friend, Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez, President and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C., and Professor Enrique Dussel-Peters, who's joining us virtually. Professor Dussel-Peters is a Graduate School of Economics professor at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, la UNAM. Well, Tino, your very insightful remarks offered a very clear description of today's world with dreams and pragmatism. And the reality is that the world is now experiencing a very deep and accelerated transformation driven by the amplification of artificial intelligence, massive flows of information, and also increased political tensions, conflict, limitations on global institutions, and the fading of a rule-based order. At the same time, new alliances and coalitions are being formed by countries that are taking stock of their relationships, are recalibrating and developing new strategies to adapt to a new reality. This panel aims to reflect on that transformation, on whether this is a rupture or is it just a transition among many dimensions: national security, governance and sovereignty, trade and supply chains disruptions, the strategic importance of critical minerals and rare earths, and natural resources, and energy affordability and sustainability. I would like to invite our panelists to consider not only the challenges that this transformation presents to the world, but rather how it impacts Latin America, as we also reflect on the opportunities in each country and across the region. We aim for this conversation to be very dynamic and to allow for a variety of viewpoints to emerge. We have prepared some questions for the panelists, but there will be time also for a Q&A from the public, and I encourage our audience to take part in this exchange very actively. Let me begin with you, Mark. Let's begin with a vision of what's going on around the world. How are China and the UN and the United States reconfiguring their approaches on foreign policy, on trade, on security, and what are those implications on Latin America?
Great. Thank you very much. I want to start by just thanking all of you for being here, and especially thanking the staff of Dr. Class. As Marisol mentioned, I'm the director for the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, and it's always a pleasure to be able to coordinate across these types of regional study centers. And like Tino, I too was an undergraduate here when we came to this building, not quite as pretty, but I think many of us learned that oftentimes it's these cross-pollination across these centers, all under the Weatherhead Center's umbrella, that really allowed us to draw these connections on international affairs. So it's just wonderful to be here, and kudos to the staff, especially for the hard work that you all have done to pull this together. So on your question, Marisol, I think it's important for us to realize that while if you go to the Kennedy School, or if you go to, say, some of the other leading public policy schools, there's a lot of talk about grand strategy and so forth. And we can think in terms of these tectonic geopolitical changes. A lot of what's happening is driven by domestic concerns, and particularly what's happening in the domestic political economy. And even though China and the United States have very different political systems, the domestic political economy in some ways has some parallels. Both are undergoing a technological transformation that is leading to, on the one hand, a lot of creation of wealth, but on the other hand, a feeling of immense insecurity, particularly economic insecurity on the part of many of the people who live in those types of societies are experiencing those firsthand. Both also have what sometimes is described as a K-shaped economy. You have a part that is growing very, very rapidly, oftentimes tied to finance, tied to investment, tied to the AI boom. But then you have another part of the economy that is being left behind. And I think what's particularly important, many of you know about that in the US context, but in the Chinese context, it's important to realize as much as China has emerged as the only credible peer rival to the United States, militarily, technologically, economically, and so forth, China's per capita income is just surpassed Argentina's, still remains below that of Brazil and Mexico's. So that suggests there's still quite a long ways to go, right? The number of Chinese who live on, say, about $3,000 a year is larger than the number of Brazilians and Mexicans combined. So that just also goes to suggest there is still a long ways to go, or you can really think of, right, that as being three different economies there together. So I think what we're seeing here is both a real geopolitical rivalry that is playing itself out, particularly in the quest for minerals, particularly for various ports, for oil and so forth, between China, the United States, and other powers. But there's also a sense that how do we deal with the domestic political economy headwinds, both for taking care of that part in the United States that keeps voting red, blue, but they're very unhappy with the status quo because they feel left behind. And also a Chinese economy that is dealing with a massive property deleveraging. And still, as I said, right, hundreds of millions of people who have not yet made their way into what might be considered upper middle income status. And it's that rivalry that's playing itself out in these other countries.
Thank you, Mark. That brings me to you, Pedro. With regards to the Donroe Doctrine, this is an interpretation of President Trump's foreign policy for the Americas. What does it mean for Latin America, and how are relationships between the U.S. and our region changing, specifically in the case of Brazil?
It's a very good question. And for Latin America, when you consider China and United States, both countries' relationship, it's nowadays the most consequential relationship for any country, not only in the world, but also in Latin America. I think the question for Donroe Doctrine, I should answer maybe in three parts. The first part, what does Donroe Doctrine mean to Latin America? For our point of view, I can say more about Brazil. I mean, Latin America is 33 countries, 34, very diverse. But what we see is a major strategic shift. Donroe Doctrine is basically an institutional design, a new one. It is a culmination of several acts that I have been watching over the last year since the new administration in the United States. It is an inflection in U.S. foreign policy, including and towards the region, towards the whole world. We were used to talk with the United States about a traditional, what you call a traditional agenda, that's human rights, institutional building, democracy. And nowadays we are talking more about defense, security issues. We understand that under the new logic of America first, make America great again. It makes sense. We are not against, but there is a repositioning of the Western Hemisphere. When I consider the Western Hemisphere as Americas, all the continent, we are in a different position right now. There was a strategic shift, and we are now considered a integral part of the U.S. defense concerns. And the U.S. is much more internally oriented right now. It wants to solve what we believe are some vulnerabilities, short-term ones, but I think still the long-term is in the other side of the ocean. It's China. So the United States is cooperating or looking for relations with Latin America with a short-term vision and a long-term vision. And the short-term vision includes Latin America, but from a defense perspective. And when we talk about defense, it's migration, drug trafficking, and criminal organizations. The administration want to call them terrorist ones. We don't agree. But what should be Latin America response to this new doctrine or this new policy? In general, I would say two terms. I mean, two aspects: a general one and a more specific one, by country. Latin America in general, I personally believe is not willing to change its engagement with China because of U.S. interests or U.S. pressure or pressure or on some coercion or whatever you want to call it. Over the last few years or decades, we are pretty much used in different shifts in Latin American policy, U.S. policy towards Latin America. And it was something related to neglect, sometimes to alarmism, sometimes to proximity. And nowadays, I think we are close to something alarmism. and try to put the Latin America under the U.S. umbrella. It's hard to cut ties with China. I think the economic ties with China are really hard to cut. And what I have been watching over the last years, maybe decades, most of the LAC leaders, they are eager to cooperate with the United States. We are, politically speaking, much more close to the United States, but we are gonna still have economic ties with China. And I give my example of Brazil. As you might know, the former President Bolsonaro, until 2019 to 22, he is a right wing. Some people call it extreme, but he was much more pro-US and anti-China. And if it depends on him, he would change a lot of Brazilian foreign policy towards China, towards the region, and Brazil towards the region. And there was an example of Huawei. You probably know the company. The company was participating in the 5G network construction in Brazil. He was participating with other companies, presenting the project. And the United States say, this company cannot participate in Brazil. That's not possible. We have security concerns, we have intelligence data, and should not participate. And I think President Bolsonaro would like to listen to the US remarks, but in the end, Huawei participated. Brazil is much more complex, and we did our analysis, and in the end, it participated. According to the president, it was not possible to participate in the government network, but after he left in 2022, the company was allowed. Although we have a lot of pressure from the US side, it happened. And for many reasons. The same example that I said, we can cooperate with the United States, but we keep the relationship with China. In 2022, the trade relationship topped $150 billion. That was a historical record in the last year of Bolsonaro administration, and it has been changing over the last few years. I was talking in general, but we can go to the specifics in each country. I think there are two aspects we should take in consideration here. One aspect is the political inclination of each country in Latin America. You can say Brazil, like right wing or left wing, or any country. It matters in terms of cooperating, having closer ties or not with the US, listening to US remarks. And there's always the structural dependence or not towards the United States and China as well. And Brazil, how Brazil would, reply on how we are behaving with this change of shifts, this inflection in U.S. policy. I think if the U.S. intention is to lock countries in its immediate borders, or to include states on the US-led or perhaps anti-China coalition in the region, I think it'll backfire, and it's not counterproductive in my personal opinion. And I would like to share two aspects of Brazil's foreign policy. I think one of the mantras of Brazil's foreign policy is not nowadays, it's decades of this. The Brazilian foreign policy has 200 years doing the same thing. It's strategic autonomy. We started like that 200 years ago. We are not changing this. We have some updates, some changes, but you want to do like this. We want no alignment. We want also pragmatism. We want universalism, and we guide ourselves through the national interests. So we do not want exclusive alliances. Usually say Brazil, we don't fit, we don't put other countries' boots, we don't carry other countries' umbrellas. We walk by ourselves, and we want to do it, continue doing this, cooperating with the United States and cooperating with China. So we do reject the logic of fixed blocks, imposition of regime changes in the region. We do not support external interference in domestic affairs and so forth and so on. And we still believe in multilateralism. We know that's pretty much common nowadays to talk about the disruption, the end of multilateralism, so forth and so on. But we are still pro the multilateral system, the UN system, the international law system, because what would be the world without rules? How would be with any rules? That's going to be very, very dangerous. I've seen a lot of people calling, oh, Brazil has a strategic balance, a strategic equilibrium doctrine, active non-alignment. That's good. I mean, academy is much more free and creative to have some words. We just call it independence, autonomy, whatever. It can be boring concept, but it's just independence. And when you talk about independence, I was talking about political, but it has the second side, the other side of the coin, that's economic pragmatism. We're not going to lock ourselves in any relationship. We have a deep relationship with China, and we're going to keep this relationship with the United States. And my personal view is that railways, transmission lines, they have no ideology. And we are a developing country. Something like 23% of our population is under the poverty line. I don't want these guys to be there. I want them to develop and to have new opportunities. And if there's a country to invest in Brazil, according to our rules, according to our standards, welcome. It can be US, it can be China, you can come and compete, including with our companies here. So Brazil the thing is, the Brazilian case, comparing to other countries that are more structurally dependent, and when I say structurally dependent, it can be in terms of economics, politics, technology, or even institutional, we are less dependent than the United States. But it doesn't mean the United States is less important, super important for Brazil. But we want to keep this pragmatism, either in the political side, strategic equilibrium or existence between the countries, but at the same time, we want to continue to have economic ties. And what we say to our U.S. counterparts when they say, hey, you cannot have this kind of trade pattern, or if China, you have close to China, it's give me an option. Give us an alternative. Nowadays, last year numbers, 170 billion of bilateral trade. Only for surplus, Brazil is 70 billion. We are one of the few countries in the world that have surplus of China. You want to change that? It's okay. Go to the market. We can shift this. You can buy our stuff. But at the same time, one of the things that the United States sells to other countries and the Brazil sells, and if you consider only China, we are competitors. We sell to China the things which like petrol, it's oil, even airplanes, we compete with the United States. So we are selling to China because they want it, because other countries are not eager or are not interested in buying our goods. So it's a very hard shift to make, either politically speaking and economically speaking, to change the situation of closeness with Latin America and Brazil.
Pedro, but it is also true that this great powers tensions have driven also to the creation of new coalitions and alliances. Do you think this could have been an accelerator that prompted the finalization of the negotiations between the EU and Mercosur as another alternative to open markets in a very pragmatic way?
Yeah. I completely agree. If you get a history of the Mercosur and the European Union negotiations, it started in the 90s. You have negotiated with the Europeans, they're very tough negotiators, for more than 20 years. And we have a lot of disagreements, but the world changed. And Brazil changed, the European Union changed. And I think it was a good reason to try to overcome these issues that we have with European countries and sign. There was the moment, because in terms of countries, China is the first trade partner of Brazil. Investments is very important, finance is very important. The United States is the second one for trade, but investments and finance is also very important. But the US stance policy towards the world and Latin America is changing, and we needed to do something. And the United States is the second partner. If we have any problems with the United States, we are having. We were sanctioned with tariffs. Before the last judicial decision, we were the most tariffed country in the world with 50% of tariffs, much more than China. So that was the exact moment to sign the agreement with the Europeans. And interesting, we were talking about India a few minutes ago. A week later, maybe 10 days later, the European Union signed a free trade agreement with India.
Yeah.
It's a country that's very conservative, if I can say that, in terms of trade negotiations. So the world is changing. In the domino, the pieces are changing. You're adapting. You're adapting, and I think looking for what is one of the tenets of the Brazilian foreign policy, that's diversification.
Yeah.
And we diversify not because it's a beautiful word, but because it is a way of avoiding possible vulnerabilities depending in one actor that can change suddenly and pressure us.
Absolutely. And then you mentioned that Brazil has this strategic autonomy, well, the size and the diversity of the Brazilian economy, but not every country in Latin America has that benefit. So that brings me to a question for you, Rebecca. And I have not forgotten you, Enrique, who's joining us in Mexico. I'll come back to you on Mexico-US relations, but let's first focus on some other aspects of the current hemispheric affairs: security, militarization, the Shield of the Americas. What do you think about collaboration in these fields, and what does the Shield of the Americas initiative represent for this hemisphere?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to DR class for the invitation. I'm a huge fan of regional studies, and it's wonderful to see a center, such a vibrant center, doing so well. And it was wonderful to meet some of the faculty members last night that are working with DR class. So the militarization issue I think it's a really important one because it's a big change. And this comes from someone, I served in the Pentagon. I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense during President Obama's second term. And I can tell you that there are real limits when it comes to what military tools can accomplish. And military tools should be considered a last resort. And I think we've seen, starting with the destruction of the vessels in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, a lot of concern surrounding those. The Southcom commander, I don't know if you all saw, but the U.S. commander of U.S. Southern Command testified recently and said that, pointed to these specific actions in the Caribbean, said those aren't going to solve anything. That they're not the answer. We'll see if he still has a job. So I want to start out by saying that. But it is right now, it does seem to be the tool of choice for the administration to the exclusion of kind of the traditional tools, the soft power tools like USAID. And I think the military does have a role to play. I will say that when it comes to the transnational organized crime that Tino referenced, but it's reliance on the military also, I think, leads to the exclusion of law enforcement. We've seen in Mexico, for example, where the military has completely supplanted law enforcement. Has that led to a reduction in crime and violence in Mexico? Not yet. And this has been the case since 2006. And it's also led to, of course, an increase in human rights abuses. The Shield of the Americas, though, I would say that it is a reflection that the number one concern for much of the region, and we see this in elections, is insecurity. It is the rising crime and violence. Tino mentioned the El Salvador case, where people are willing to give up certain core democratic principles in exchange for a sense of security. But the question is, how sustainable is that? Also, even if you are a fan of the Bukele model, can that travel? The situation in El Salvador is very different than it is even in Guatemala, much less Chile, where, of course, CAST is talking about some of these tools in Chile. I would say one thing about the Shield of the Americas that I think makes a lot of sense is the need for a regional approach. Transnational organized crime does not respect borders, so the region does need to come together, and there needs to be more intelligence sharing, more potentially joint training, joint exercises. But it was not a full regional gathering it left out, for example, Brazil, it left out Colombia, and it left out Mexico.
More than half of the regional GDP,
yes,
or when
right,
sorry,
right.
sorry.
No, exactly. And the other thing I would say is that these dramatic kind of tactical wins, they're very popular. So these seizures, off the coast of name your country, or the destruction of a lab in the jungle, that people like to see that. But it doesn't necessarily lead to lasting results. So, I very much hope that as the U.S. government is thinking about the Shield of the Americas, that it recognizes the importance of or the limits on the military. There was a meeting on Thursday before the Shield of the Americas at U.S. Southern Command. It was a larger group, but I don't remember if it was Secretary Hegseth or Stephen Miller, who's kind of made a joke. I think it might have been a joke. I kind of hope it was a joke, that, there's a reason we don't have any legal or judicial representatives here. This is because this is about the military. The military needs to do this. But they're totally ignoring the fact that you do need a strong judicial institutions. You do need strong prisons. You need to have prison reform. You need to have prevention policies to have any of these gains stick. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're all hoping. Well,
Yeah.
but it is true that Mexico, Colombia, Brazil were not included in the Shield of the Americas meeting, but I would assume and hope that there are bilateral channels to deal with security matters with the three countries, and especially Mexico and Colombia, given the importance of the security aspect and for the United States as well. So that brings me.
Can I really quickly
Yes,
on
please.
Mexico? So
Please,
sorry.
please.
I'll be very quick. Mexico has really, Claudia Sheinbaum has really kind of complied with the demands that have come from the Trump administration. I do worry, though. I just want to put this out there. I think with the death of El Mencho, that was a big step for U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. But I don't think that the idea of a unilateral U.S. military intervention in Mexico is off the table. I think that we will probably be hearing more about that in the future. And I do think if that were to happen, that would cause such damage in the bilateral relationship, and not just on security, but across the bilateral relationship.
I hope cooperation is enhanced in a bilateral way. And I would like to now ask you, Enrique, thank you for joining from Mexico. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, UMSCA, which replaced NAFTA in 2020, and it governs an estimated $1.8 trillion in the trade of goods and services, scheduled to begin its formal review very soon. Mexico has seen a lower than expected growth despite the nearshoring trend, and many believe that the uncertainties posed by the UMSCA revision could have paid a toll on the Mexican economy. I would like to ask you two questions. One is, in your opinion, what are those structural reforms missing in Mexico? And two, how is Mexico positioning itself in light of its closely intertwined economic and very ample relation with the United States? But also, what is the potential opportunity with China in light of current U.S. policy?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much, Marisol, for the presentation. I would have loved to be at your class. Been visiting the U.S. since I was a child, and for whatever reason, my visa was canceled a few days ago, which is related probably to some of the topics we are discussing. And I put it very politely. I would simply like to highlight in a provocative, but also as an invitation, I would like to highlight 2 or 3 topics, and I will, of course, get to your questions. I humbly believe that, unfortunately, the so-called think tanks in Washington, D.C. are not doing their job regarding the Latin American, Caribbean-China relationship. No, they have not been integrating and incorporating the results in the 21st century regarding business organizations, governments, and the academic sector. And this is not only an academic discussion, but this is important since the audience in Washington is ill-informed. No? So when you see some of the hearings in the Senate and other places, the level of the discussion it's unfortunately very poor. No? A third topic, and this relates to your question and to this to the think tanks in Washington, D.C., is that I would highlight that from a Latin American and Caribbean perspective, 2 issues are fundamental. No? First, simply to acknowledge the increasing size, importance, and dynamics of China's economy. No? According to the International Monetary Fund and measured in PPP, no? Since 2016, China's economy is already the biggest of the world. And you can measure this in constant US dollars, current US dollars, or whatever. The discussion is not if, but when the Chinese economy is going to be the largest of the world. And this is fundamental for Latin America and the Caribbean because China's presence, socioeconomic presence in Latin America has been increasing since the 1990s. And this has not been sufficiently acknowledged neither by the think tanks, but also neither by the US government. No? Suddenly, since 2022, 2023, the topic comes out, no? And that China is in the backyard of the United States, no? But this has been going on for 3 decades, no? So the response of the United States since the Biden administration, 2023, comes too late, no? And so trying to cancel China in Latin America from Friday to Sunday or to Monday is going to be very, very difficult. And the second topic that is at least as relevant is that in Latin America, and this relates, of course, to some of the topics highlighted by Stephen Levitsky and Tino, is that in Latin America straight, and we have been working on this for Brazil, for Mexico, for Argentina, China in Latin American imports has become increasingly the technological leader. In 2025, more than 30% of Mexico's imports were capital goods. No other country, not the United States, has achieved such a high level of capital goods in terms of the composition of Mexican imports. And this is fundamental for the discussion regarding USMCA and the question regarding this new triangular relationship between the United States, China, and Mexico, and Latin America, Brazil, as presented by Pedro Enrique and others, no? Because in this discussion and negotiation of USMCA, which is currently going, The high difficulty for the United States and for Mexico will be to substitute for Chinese imports, which in many cases are already the technological leader. No? This refers not only to electric vehicles and batteries and harnesses and electrical goods, telecommunications, and many others. The difficulty will be to substitute for Mexican imports from China, and the challenge to substitute them by other countries, so imports from other countries. The goal would be to achieve this through US imports, but today, the technological level of firms from the United States is not high enough in most of the cases. No? And I would simply finish highlighting regarding the challenges of USMCA today. So today, more than 20% of Mexican imports in 2025 come from China, and the goal is to decrease this share. But I simply would highlight that the main importers in terms of firms in Mexico are transnational corporations and United States firms established in Mexico. 70% of Mexican imports from China come from US firms and transnational corporations. No? So welcome to a very complex new triangular relationship regarding trade, but also investments, tourism, Confucius Institutes, and many other topics between Mexico and China. And in this negotiation between the US and Mexico that is going on today.
Thank you, Enrique. Rebecca, your
Sorry.
perspective from Washington.
I just have to say, on behalf of the Inter-American Dialogue, we are the only think tank in Washington, D.C. that is dedicated to the Americas. And we have a very robust China and Latin America program run by the wonderful Margaret Myers. So I just would like to make that point, and I encourage everyone to look at our website and to look at the work of Margaret Myers. In fact, she just testified, and I know she has worked with Pedro in the past, but sorry, I just had to put that out there after the comment about the think tanks in Washington not working on China.
Very quick reaction. Thank you, Rebecca. Let me move to BRI. BRI is the Belt and Road Initiative by China, with which China has been forging relations with Latin America through investments in infrastructure, and it has become quite a relevant trade partner as well, especially for South America. How are national security and sovereignty concerns regarding critical infrastructure being approached, and how is China's influence in Latin America evolving in the face of increasing U.S. pressure to curb it?
Yeah, so thanks very much for that question, Marisol. I'm going to make 3 points in relationship to this, and I hopefully I don't know how provocative I will be, but I mean for these to really sort of provoke some thought in all this. The first is, we talk about Latin America, but Latin America is a very complicated region, and we're really talking about differences between Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. And so what I want to suggest is I think this influence, the security concerns are going to be paramount, particularly for Mexico, the Caribbean, and those two regions. And to some extent, for Central America, particularly for Panama in the canal. But I think it's a different equation than we're talking about South America. So that's the first point that I want to make. When it comes to if the United States has concerns in the Caribbean, if the United States has concerns with Mexico over BRI investments because of national security concerns, I think for what Rebecca highlighted earlier, the United States will make those concerns felt and it will apply pressure. That I would be surprised if the governments did not respond. If the governments did not respond, believe the United States would not hesitate to ratchet this up. And that would be true even under an administration to succeed the Trump administration. So that's the first point that I want to make. The second point, though, that I want to make is to say, I think while BRI today has led to some synergistic investments, particularly in areas of infrastructure and perhaps minerals development and lithium processing and so on and so forth. I think we're entering a new phase when it comes to BRI. And that goes back to what I mentioned previously, which is driven by China's domestic political economy. China just, the goodwill diplomatic push from BRI plus the low-hanging fruit of, let's make an investment for a port to allow us to access minerals from a given mine and so forth. That's been had. But also from a Chinese deleveraging standpoint, there's just not the money to go out. So we're seeing more of a small is beautiful, much more tactical. And so in that sense, I think the sort of synergistic political gains that you have, right? Sort of what we alluded to earlier, the splashy, we got this is leading to this amount of jobs. That's not going to happen in the next 10 years to the extent that governments in Latin America were able to reap that for the last 10 years. So that's the second point that I want to make. And then I think the third point that I want to suggest is we are having countries asking, what has BRI done for us? And that equation looks very different if you're in particular countries in South America, where it has really led to infrastructure investments, where it's led to, right, sort of what Pedro alluded to earlier, the ability to sort of develop a synergistic trade relationship than in other parts where that hasn't been true, particularly for countries in Latin America that are not so resource endowed or commodities based. But I think even in the former, there is a question from an economic standpoint, these should be peers, right, in terms of per capita GDP. But when you're looking at it in terms of who's providing the high value inputs versus who's providing raw commodities and so forth, who's continuing to go on an upward trajectory versus who's not. There is a concern, I think, that what we may be moving from a trading relationship among peers or peer equals to a quasi-neocolonial type of arrangement, or at least we aren't seeing a two-way benefit here. And I think that is going to play itself out as well over the next couple of years when it comes to the BRI relationship. And once that does, you will see those who do not want to continue this start to use security as the angle by which to disentangle this. And we're seeing this, right, I think in one extent, we saw this already in Panama, but we may see this elsewhere over the next couple of years. Because as I alluded to, right, China is facing economic headwinds. China has a sizable population that it wishes to move into middle income status. And this is leading to an overcapacity issue that is making the middle income trap even more severe for Latin American countries, particularly as they look to compete vis-a-vis other Asian countries like Vietnam or India and so forth that are benefiting from the resiliency sort of reconfiguration of supply chains. I think Mexico is a completely different category, being a next door neighbor of the United States, being so integrated. But I also think that what Enrique alluded to, I would be surprised if USMCA does not lead to some changes in rules of origin, where if you're continuing to use Mexico as a transshipment point, you are not going to get those zero tariffs. And so that, this is all very much up for grabs, and security is kind of the umbrella overall here that's going to reconfigure this economic relationship over the next decade.
Thank you, Mark. Couldn't agree more that relations are asymmetrical depending on the perspectives from which you are looking, either the US or China, with Central America probably and Mexico closer intertwined with the US, and the South maybe with some more autonomy. But globally as well, the BRICS bloc, which now comprises 1/4 of the global economy and half of the world's population, has also been seen as a challenge to Western-dominated institution of global economic governance. And it has also been interpreted as a way of displacing the US dollar from its predominance in the world economy. In 2025, President Trump told reporters that the BRICS was dead. And now, in light of the current circumstances with the expanded membership in BRICS, that includes Iran and the United Arab Emirates, for example, among other countries that were recently invited to join and to partner with BRICS. How do you think that BRICS will evolve in the coming years, Pedro?
Well, first of all, I mean, BRICS is not dead. I was there in Rio last year for the summit, for the leader summit. I was there. The people were there. We were chatting and having a very productive meeting. So it's not that. And what the inputs and the remarks we get from the U.S. counterparts is that definitely President Trump doesn't like BRICS. He hates what was a diplomat told us that he hates BRICS. But I mean, actually, he threatened to impose taxes to BRICS countries just after the election. He threatened to put 100%. In January, he said again 100%. And when we were in Rio having the meeting, he threatened to put 10% taxes on BRICS countries. I personally see that the BRICS countries is not getting. They're actually appearing to be an ascendant tendency over the last few years, not getting weaker or whatever you want to think. I think it's getting stronger. And I have three arguments for you to support this vision. The first one, the BRICS in terms of numbers is expanding. It used to be 4 countries. In 2010 to 2011, South Africa joined the BRICS, and 2 years ago, not only Iran, but United Arab States and Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia joined the BRICS. And last year, it was the time for Indonesia. So we are expanding. And the main objective of this is to get a more inclusive, a more representative group of developing countries or members of the global south, as you wanna call them, and with more countries that could join the meeting, join the bloc in terms of demographic, economic, energy, technology aspects. It's good. We are advocating for a more just and democratic world and with a more space for developing countries in the multipolar arena. So we want more countries to be part of this group. The second aspect I would like to highlight, the BRICS footprint is expanding as well. We have 2 institutions. One of them is the new development bank that's based in Shanghai, that provides development finance to countries. It was created 10 years ago, but now it's getting on track. It was created because we thought there was a need to foster financing to developing countries, to have more options to developing countries. I just mentioned we are a developing country. We have our issues. We have poverty. I want to take them people out of this situation. And to have another option, why not? And there was another institutional that was created, a contingent reserve agreement. So is that expanding? Institutionally is getting more condensed, it's stronger. But I think nowadays, BRICS became even more important when multilateralism is under attack. We are not a fixed bloc. I don't know, we can say ourselves as a bloc, but maybe a group, maybe it's better. We are not fixed. We agree to disagree. So we have very different countries with very different views. We have Brazil, Iran, China, Russia, India in the same bloc. But the idea that BRICS is anti-Western is wrong. The idea that BRICS is against Western or against any country is unfolded. We are just a platform. We are just a group of countries that consider themselves to have similar characteristics, state characteristics, and you want to just sit down and discuss possibilities of the reform of global governance. That's it. And we have some points that we agree. That's easier to agree. When you talk about reform of international multilateral organizations, we do agree. We are developing countries. We want to get more voices from the global south, but we want also the UN to be respected. We want international law, but what is important to take into consideration, we are not fixed. So you have to consider the official opinion stance of Brazil is different from China, it's different from Russia, it's different from India. And when you get the declarations, the summit, the leaders' declaration, if you read through it, we talk about all the topics in the world, the hot topics and the thorny ones. But it's pretty much clear that like when you have a consensus, it's on the paper. We don't have the consensus, we just take notes. And besides this criticism of anti-Western that I personally do not agree, there is also things or accusations that you want to have a BRICS currency, we are anti-US dollar group. I do not agree as well. I think it's much more a finance and a market strategy. We have our leaders mentioning in the last few years to increase trade using our currencies. It's not because we do not want to use the US dollars, not at all, but we want to create alternatives, business, market alternatives for the exporters or importers to use cheaper options for doing trade. And that's it. And I would like to invite you to read the summit leaders' declarations. And we have finance ministers meetings, we have central bank governors meetings, and in most of this declaration, it's pretty much clear. We don't talk nothing against the US dollar. It's not even mentioned, but it's just trade using local currency. And then we are already using this with China and the other countries. We do not force any of our businessmen to use US or the real or the yuan. Just give them an option, and if they consider themselves is financially speaking more interesting, go for it.
Thank you, Pedro, for those clarifications. Many would argue that with such a diversity, it is not easy to reach consensus, whereas, for example, in our hemisphere, with 9 elections happening between last year and this year, with Bolivia, Honduras, Costa Rica, Chile, Guyana, Ecuador, and the upcoming elections in Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, there is some assumptions that the region will and have already gone shifting to more conservative governments that are like-minded with the current US administration. And we're running out of time, but I would not want to forego the opportunity to come back to the region. And there's been 2 very important issues. One that was at the center of global focus at the beginning of the year, and that was Venezuela, the US operation in Venezuela. How do you think the US and China will navigate with competing interests with regards to the reconstruction of Venezuela and the wealth? And I'd like to ask you, Rebecca, for your opinion on that. And later, I would also like to pick your brain on Cuba and what you foresee for Cuba. Please, Rebecca.
Thank you for the question. So your framing of the question talked about the reconstruction and the kind of the China element. And first of all, I would say when it comes to the reconstruction of Venezuela, we need everyone. This needs, and I think the United States needs to recognize that it is in the U.S. and the region's interest for the U.S. not to try to go alone. And so I would say that about China. I would also, though, highlight kind of the current situation in Venezuela and some concerns I have. One is just the democracy, the future of is I think, Steve talked about democracy, the importance of democracy and the comment on democracy in the United States. We see right now that is not the priority of the Trump administration. I don't think anyone, or we were chatting about this last night. I think that the fact that Maduro is no longer leading Venezuela, I think it's hard to argue that that is not a good thing. However, I think it's just, we have to be really clear-eyed about the fact that the person now who is governing Venezuela is Delcy Rodriguez. I don't need to tell this group who she is and what her history has been. And I see in some ways that we're not moving in the right direction. And I think one example of that is the replacement of Padrino Lopez, the Minister of Defense, who, on paper, it looks like a good thing. I mean, he had been running the Venezuelan armed forces since 2014. But the person who replaced him, another general, ran the intelligence agents, Sabine, twice, and was sanctioned in 2015 for his role in the repression following the 2014 protests. He's a very close partner of Diosdado Cabello. I think we all know who Diosdado Cabello is, who is also still there. So if we kind of look at the cupola right now, it's not pretty. I very much hope we start to hear more about timeline for democratic elections in Venezuela. I think that's going to be critical. And another thing I think, and this has to do with your question about reconstruction, is the focus right now on oil. I think we need to think more about the Venezuelan people, and we think about economic recovery more broadly, and make sure that there are benefits to the Venezuelan people. Otherwise, this whole it's not going to be credible. I think it's not going to be viewed as legitimate. So I think we have an opportunity right now, and I think there are reasons for hope, but I think we also have to be very clear-eyed on Venezuela.
And what about Cuba? What do you foresee for Cuba?
So what do I foresee for Cuba? I would start out by saying I don't think the Trump administration has stated a clear objective for what it wants in Cuba, which makes it really hard to predict. We know that Secretary Rubio, this has been a priority for him throughout his career. And for Rubio, it has been about a transition, a democratic transition. His most recent statement, however, is that it doesn't have to happen all at once. And I think that, there is, we do know, I don't have any secret insights into the nature of the conversations that are going on, but we do know that the Trump administration is talking to members of the communist regime. And one of the ideas that's out there is replacing Miguel Diaz-Canel with someone else from within the regime. There isn't, at this point, a Dulce-type figure who would assume that role. Mm-hmm. And I also think that if that were to happen, I think it would fall flat. Something else is that I would say that the pressure for economic opening, the humanitarian situation in Cuba was really incredible. It was a crisis before what happened on January 3rd, but now with the halt of all oil shipments, not just from Venezuela, but also from Cuba, I think everyone's reading about what this means for the life on the island, the impact on the healthcare system, transport, food insecurity, water, access to potable water. I mean, it's incredibly difficult. So I think that the international community really needs, I hope that the international community surges humanitarian assistance in the short term. The US is channeling assistance through the Catholic Church. Mexico has been providing assistance, Canada, but it's not going to address just the magnitude of the crisis. The push for an economic opening, I think it makes sense. I mean, there's been, close to 70 years of economic mismanagement coupled with sanctions and then dependency on one external actor after the next. But I would point out that under President Obama, that was one of the reasons for the opening to Cuba, was to push for these very economic reforms, giving more space to the Cuban private sector, which I think is the right thing.
But did it happen?
So what people were disappointed about is I think there was an assumption that the reducing kind of some of the state control over the economy and also opening up to the private sector, that it would lead to democracy and it didn't. You could argue that there wasn't time for that to happen because it was quickly reversed when Trump assumed the presidency, and I will say that President Biden also did not turn back to that policy.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very, very insightful. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't want to be accused of not having touched on AI and technology. And I have not forgotten you, Enrique, but let me come now to Mark. And given that Latin America's potential to become a very key player in technological innovation with the rich endowment that the region has in terms of natural resources, rare earths, and mineral resources, what kind of strategic alliances with China and the United States could help the region move in such a direction? And what lessons can we learn from experiences that this country should be replicated or avoided in terms of technological innovation?
Great. So I think let me take the AI supply chain divided up in two parts. Your question touches first on the front part of the supply chain, particularly the raw material inputs and particularly the rare earths and other critical minerals. So I think China has certainly made and been very strategic about making a series of investments in that area. And China, even despite my comments earlier about scaling back up BRI investments, continues to do so quite a bit and does so in an integrated fashion, not just with the mines, but also with the infrastructure to get it to the ports and the port upgrading and so on and so forth. The United States is rolling out a plan under the Trump administration, the contours of which are still not clear as to what these critical mineral partnerships will be. And I think a lot will turn on what that looks like. And specifically, what you hear from other countries is, what's the type of financing? What's the type of technological investment you're going to be making? And so forth, right? And Brazil asks this question all the time, right? With some of the new discoveries and so forth. And it's just not being provided on the scale that China is doing and has been very strategic about. And we'll see whether these new partnerships do that. I think the lesson for Latin America, though, is how do you ensure this is not just simply extract and move on, but you can actually upskill. And I think the next part on that chain, though, however, is a very tricky one, particularly for democracies, because it's about processing. And that processing is going to have negative environmental spillovers. And it sometimes is done on the backs of indigenous or poor communities. And so, but if there's not that ability to do so, then it's going to be extracted, moved to be processed in China and other parts of Asia where there is that processing capabilities. So I think that's one real question as to what are those types of trade-offs and how can you make those types of trade-offs in democracies? And I think that's one live question. The other part, though, I want to focus on is on the consumer-facing, right? And I think the middle part of the stack, we see large-scale platforms in the right. So I think those are going to be dominated by scale players. But the other part is the consumer-facing element of it. And there, when it comes to the internet e-commerce, Latin America was very successful, particularly with regards to Spanish language ones because of the size of the market, thinking about doing this on an integrated basis across different countries. You think about Mercado Libre or other things of that sort. And so the question is whether or not Latin America can partner with the major consumer-facing AI providers to provide the types of applications that allow you to serve your markets in an integrated fashion in a way that can also do this, that's app specific, community specific, but also allows you to monetize those types of gains. I think Latin America was a success story when it came to the first e-commerce. And the question is whether or not it can replicate that again in AI. And it did so in partnership, but also ensuring that local service providers also reap those types of gains. So that's what I'll say, right, in terms of the story is still yet to be played out. I think anyone who tells you they know what this is going to look like 3 years from now, they're sort of spinning what the version they want you to see. But I think that's what I would say are the lessons here for the next stage.
True. Let's hope that Latin American leaders, both from the private sector, but also heads of state and legislators, are able to grasp the moment, prepare for the adoption of AI so that it leads to an accelerated development for Latin American societies, for the sustainable use of the rich resources that we have in our region. But also, I think, to prepare for job displacement, which is something that we should not forget about. Maria is signaling that we are almost running out of time. And I would not want but to to give the opportunity for our audience to ask questions. There's so many topics that we have addressed, but I'm sure there's many in the minds of our audience that would like also to be asked. So I would like to invite you to raise your hand and please let us know who you're directing your question to. Please.
Thank you. My question is for Rebecca. I noticed that the UAE signed a deal with the government of Colombia to construct a number of data centers in Colombia. I was wondering if you've been keeping an eye on that and also the degree to which this might signal that the Middle Eastern players are also starting to play a role in the region.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because I would say I'll answer in kind of a broader way, if that's okay. But when we were talking about strategic autonomy and the fact that in many ways, you know, when Pedro was speaking about the Brazilian position and kind of reducing vulnerabilities, you know, when I think about strategic autonomy for the region and what if I were, you know, leading a country in the region, I would. Well, I think one of the best ways to kind of deal with this competition and kind of this, sometimes even being asked to make a choice, which, as Pedro said, is not a realistic request at all, or it's not something that's possible in many cases. You know, I think that ideally, one of the region would be much more powerful if it was able to band together, but we know how polarized and fractured the region is. But I think the other way is to diversify partnerships. And I think we are seeing the Middle East playing, you know, certain Middle Eastern countries kind of coming in, and I think that actually makes a lot of sense for the region. I think the Middle East, we talked about India, EU, I think all of that would be in the interest of the countries of the region, including Colombia.
Hello, my name is Rodrigo. I come from Querétaro, Mexico. My question is for Mario. So in Querétaro, for example, Amazon recently announced a large data center build out, and it was promoted in La Mañanera as this large investment bringing a ton of jobs. In reality, it's only going to make the water scarcity problem bigger and bringing only, I think, 40 jobs to the state. My question is, how does Mexico, Latin America, with a power dynamic where most of this technology for AI is getting developed in the global north, can participate in not only helping on the build out for some of these data centers, but also getting the benefits of some of these new technologies while also democratizing the access to this without exploiting the natural resources of the region?
I'll start, but if others, I think others on this panel will weigh in. The suggestion that I made, right, is on some of these layers of the stack, there's a scale advantage. And so Latin America is not going to get there unless it acts in more of an integrated manner. Mm-hmm. But then on other elements of it, they're going to be very much catered towards specific applications that are community specific. And there, I think Latin America needs to do what it did in the e-commerce, right? In the first digital wave there, where it needs to make sure that these can flow across borders so that you have this ability to scale on that, but you could develop solutions that cater to the local communities such that you have a very credible player on e-commerce against the Amazon, right? We mentioned the region and so forth. So I think it's going to be looking at doing that, but I think also importantly, tapping into the entrepreneurship of the young people and the talent in the region, investing in the engineering capabilities as well as the computer science capabilities. All of that is important, and all of that is a continued state. And we did see Latin America do that at the downstream end of this, I think, with regards to the first digital revolution. And so I think that would be some of what I take away as the lessons here. But others want to chime in?
Any other complementary?
Yeah.
Enrique, please.
Yes, again, here it would be important, Mark and Rebecca, to understand that this discussion of integrating Mexico's productive sector is not new in Mexico. This has been going on at least since the 1970s. So you will find hundreds of proposals, analysis, etc., particularly regarding Mexico's export-oriented sector, maquiladoras, IMEX today, etc., and how to add value to these processes, to these global value chains. No, this has been going on long before the new triangular relationship China in Latin America and in Mexico, and so old discussions regarding import substitution, integration, Amazon in Querétaro, but also Huawei in Querétaro, no? These discussions have been going on for a long, long time. So it would be very fruitful to integrate these discussions in 2026 based on policies, results, instruments, etc. No, and simply to link these discussions with the title of the seminar, no, Latin America, China, and the U.S. I would simply invite you to consider that yes, China has been in Latin America and in Mexico a very dynamic and new actor in the 21st century, but please let us not overemphasize China's presence in Latin America and most of each of the countries. Only 20% Latin America's trade today, foreign trade, is being pursued with China. In the case of Brazil, more. In the case of Mexico, less so. So this means that 80% of Latin America's trade is being pursued by non-Chinese partners. No, so the U.S., the European Union, intra-Latin American trade is fundamental, and in terms of investments, in the case of Mexico, China's share in Mexico's FDI is 3%. So 97% of Mexico's FDI is non-Chinese. No? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enrique. Very, very clear. 2 questions here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Elizabeth Trujillo. I'm a professor of law at the University of Houston and the director of the Global Law and Policy for the Americas. Thank you very much for this wonderful program. And I guess I look at many of these issues through the lens of trade. And so my question for the panel, I have a 2-part question. So my question for the panel is sort of, what do you see the role of trade in recalibrating some of the issues regarding supply chains, the competitive strategic partnerships that we see evolving, particularly with respect to the technological growth in AI? You know, if you see some parallels with the 1990s, as was mentioned by the keynote, you know, you had a move towards globalization, right, and multilateral trade. But now we see a move away from that, as well as having this technological industrial sort of revolution. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in terms of, where do you see the role of regional trade? You see the EU expanding its regional partnerships around the world. You see China doing the same. The US is taking a different approach, much more sectoral, transactional. So that's my first part of the question. And I appreciate Mark's comments about sort of differentiating between the countries in Latin America, and particularly Mexico. And this question, I guess, is more for Enrique, which is, where do you see Mexico's position strategically? It seems like it would have a strategic position with respect to the United States in the USMCA review, but also with the rest of its Latin American partners, as well as China and the EU. So do you see this as an opportunity for Mexico to perhaps play an important role in sort of being that catalyst or that link there with respect to these other partners around the world and recalibrating the supply chains?
Enrique, would you please answer that second part of the question? And maybe Mark, if you want to come back to the first part of the question.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I would highlight that Mexico is in a very difficult situation regarding the current negotiation. No, Mexico is by no means a victim, but the proposal by the United States in very general terms and regarding specific items such as their regional value added and et cetera, is very complex and very difficult since the US, in very general terms, would like to erase the presence of China in Latin America and in Mexico. No? Regarding Confucius Institutes, tourism, infrastructure, but also in terms of trade. But again, the integration of China in Mexico's productive sector and in the export-oriented sector, we have done very detailed work regarding, imagine the following, regarding China's value added in Mexican exports to the United States. In 2020, last data of input-output matrices, 7.5% of Mexican exports to the US is Chinese value added. The main source of this Chinese value added are transnational corporations and US firms. No? So welcome to a very complex negotiation that will be particularly difficult for US firms established in Mexico, which are massively importing from China. No? Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique.
So I'll give a quick answer to the first question. I mean, I think trade, investment, and so forth are very important inputs to trying to address questions of upgrading, upskilling, providing foreign technology, even addressing inequality, dealing with social mobility and all that. I think that's true everywhere, and that's true in Latin America. But in terms of, is trade the metric that's going to sort of define whether countries pull ahead or not? I would posit to say, going back to this morning's keynote and some of the work that Steve and others have done, I would say first and foremost, it's about institutions, not about trade. If you don't have the institutions, no matter how many trade agreements you sign, no matter how much foreign investment flows in and so forth, those institutions are necessary to make sure that the spillover effects from increased trade filter out and so forth. So I think that's the first thing that I would highlight. The second word that I would highlight that I think is more important than trade is productivity, because we see countries who've continued to run trade surpluses, that have continued to see their exports grow, even their percentage of global trade grow and so forth. But their global competitiveness is going to get hampered in an era where much of what it takes is about how nimble, how capable your different population segments are, whether that's dealing with challenges from AI upskilling or whether that deals with lower questions about manufacturing and robotics and so on and so forth. But I think that's those productivity challenges and those institutional challenges, I would say, are much more critical to the region than, say, how many trade agreements it signs or whether or not. And that's not to say that's not important, but like I said, I think there are first order things. Trade and investment happen when there's a productive workflows, when there's stable institutions, when there's certainty that you're going to see.
Mark, and what would be the factors that you would like to highlight as very key drivers of productivity that Latin America needs to focus on?
It's a good question, right? Because from a competitive standpoint, and I go back to, I think Mexico is in a unique position, yes, right? Because Mexico is the next door neighbor to the world's still largest economy. Depends on how you measure. I know some people, right? Or it's one of the world's two largest economies, right? And so, but I think it's very different for the others, right? There's a question over what segment are you looking to focus on? How are you going? So I think some of this is about education, human capital, particularly for the types of skills that are very, very important. But others of it are just simply about, right, are you able to churn out output at a higher rate than, say, increasingly it's going to be a robot, right? But the other, and so if you're not able to do so, a lot of this will be mechanized and much more localized, right? And so forth. And then I think there's a whole series of jobs that we don't know, but every technological revolution has led to a new series of jobs that we couldn't anticipate. My roommate was, came for 30th reunion, said, I graduated, and 3 years later, I had a job that I didn't even know existed when I came to university. And this was the .com revolution, right? I think we all have a sense this technological revolution could be a much larger than that. And so I think then it's also about, right, those types of adaptive creative ability partnered with the engineering capabilities that are going to be critical there. But I don't even know how to think about that in some ways, right? So.
Thank you, Mark. We have a question from Luis.
Hi, Mauricio Vila, mid-career MPA student from Mexico. My question will be to Rebecca. We hear a lot about what the U.S. expects that Mexican government do about fighting the drug cartels. My question will be, what will be the perspective from the U.S. side about the Mexico demands? Lowering demand, stopping the U.S. weapons going to the hands of Mexican cartels, stopping the cash flow that allows the drug cartels to run their everyday business.
That's the perennial question, right? Under both Republican and Democratic administrations, is what are we going to do about the flow of weapons from the U.S. into Mexico? Of course, it's also having a huge impact in the Caribbean. When you look at the percentage of weapons received that are of U.S. origin. So I know when the last bilateral security discussions did talk about how to do a better job for the U.S. to do a better job in this area. I know that there's an opportunity to shed more light on this with the case, the Mexican government's case that is before the U.S. courts. I agree that much more needs to be done. I don't know what it's going to take for that really to take place, because as you alluded to, the U.S. is making some pretty incredible demands on President Sheinbaum, which have real implications for her domestically and for her base. So what I would say is I think it's really important that there is more give and take in this relationship. I'm not sure. Your question made me think of something else, and something that we hear is that there's a sense in Mexico that the United States is constantly moving the goalposts. So you do one thing, and that's not enough, and so there's a new demand. I think that I think that is likely to continue. But as far as I agree. I don't know what it's going to take for the U.S. to really take this problem seriously. I think we have a lot of, as you know, there are certain domestic politics, there's certain issues with, the gun lobby in the United States, but there are things that could be done. And I think, from the perspective of the Inter-American Dialogue, we're not an advocacy organization, but what we can do is we can draw more attention to this. And I think here at institutions like Harvard as well, because there has to be a give and take in any bilateral relationship. And if the U.S. is concerned about security, like you said, and it's, with its next door neighbor, the U.S. has to recognize the role that it's playing by this just constant flow. What is it called? Like the iron flow? I know that there's a name for this, the flow of weapons to the United States. From the United States to Mexico. That probably wasn't a very, it's probably not the answer that you want, but I think there's a long way to go.
Mauricio is the former governor of the state of Yucatan.
I'd love to know your perspective.
We'll invite you to next panel, Mauricio. Thank you for that. We have a room for another 2 questions, please.
So great, thank you for the talk. I'm João Pedro, I'm a PhD student here at the department. And my question is for the panel, and it's about multilateralism. Because
Can you repeat?
multilateralism. Because we have a very important election this year that I don't think people are paying enough attention yet, which is the election for Secretary General of the United Nations. And according to the informal rule of regional rotation, the next Secretary General is supposed to be a Latin American. So we have some candidates already. Michelle Bachelet from Chile, Rebecca Grispan, Secretary General of UNCTAD from Costa Rica, the Argentinian who is the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we have several Latin American candidates. And the problem is that all the P5 have to agree on a given candidate. So the US, China, Russia would have to find a common ground to elect a given candidate. So what would you anticipate regarding that, and what are the implications of this election for the future of multilateralism?
Well, the field just got a little smaller because President Cast has said that Michelle Bachelet will not be Chile's candidate.
But Brazil is endorsing Bachelet instead.
So Brazil and Mexico are.
Mexico.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we have,
That is-
if I can join.
I didn't mean to applaud. That was.
Yes, Pedro, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. It's a very important question. As you might know, the Secretary General of the United Nations has a lot of importance in the guidance of the institution. The institution is under attack over the last few years. And over the last decades, Brazil and other developing countries are talking about, we need to reform it. We have to give more space to developing countries or global south, whatever you wanna call it. Not only developing countries, but maybe other countries in the global north, if you wanna call it. We have a candidate. As you mentioned, it's Michelle Bachelet, and we think she is the most capable person to run the organization, not only because she was part of the organization. Well, she was former president of Latin American country, as you correctly mentioned. It is time to have a Latin American Secretary General in the United Nations, and she's also a woman. So possibly it's the first time you're gonna have a woman in charge of a very important organization. And what strikes me more, it's more from a personal point of view. There is a consensus that the United Nations should be reformed. And there are a lot of people saying that's not going to be reformed. I say the reform is going on. Whatever you want to call it or not, it's going on, because you have some countries that are opposing the institutions, a lot of countries actually. There are some countries that are restricting the contribution to the United Nations for the budget. And the Secretary General has to make choices. And the fact of he has to make choices is a matter of reform. He has to direct funds to certain organizations, one of the 14 agencies, and have to take funds from the other side. This is a matter of reform. So to have Michelle Bachelet as a Secretary General completes a lot of marks according to Brazilian in other countries, Mexico and others, that support her candidacy, because we think whatever happens, if there's a real reform or ongoing reform, she is the most capable person to tackle all these challenges we have been seeing over the last years.
Being very pragmatic, it will be up to the permanent 5 to decide, because they have a veto. So I hope they have the wisdom to choose the best candidate. But Enrique, also, please.
So I would simply like to highlight, which is fundamental for this question, that from the perspective of Robert Lighthizer, the new National Security Strategy paper published a few weeks ago, multilateralism is dead. No? If we do not explicitly integrate the view of the founder of the current global order, I don't know what we are exactly discussing. So BRICS and others at the UN system might agree on some topic, But again, the United States has a very clear and explicit view of not participating in this transformation of the UN system and of a global order. No? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enrique. Thank you very much. We have room. We will take the two questions, first with the gentleman in green and then with you. Short questions because we're running out of time and I don't want to get in trouble with Maria. Please.
My name is Richard Strasser. I've been an investor in the region for more than 25 years. And my question is for Mark. You made a comment that you think that the strength of institutions is very important to create an investment flows. I can see that with American investors. If you're investing in an infrastructure project which has a 20 or 30-year life, you want to make sure that there's rule of law, that the rules are stable, that the ethics is stable, et cetera. And that's important for a data center or a port. I'm not so sure with Chinese investors, which may have some state influence on their investment decisions. So I'd like to press you a little bit on that.
Very good question, Mark.
You want to take the other question as well? Together, or you want me to?
Yeah,
you want to go
we can bundle
sequentially?
them. Yes,
Okay.
please.
Yeah, can you turn on the mic, please?
Hi, thank you. I will be quick. My name is Rodrigo. I am from Monterrey, Mexico, and I am a former MCMPA graduate. My question is, what do you think is the role of the private sector in this reshaping of the world's order? Right? Sometimes we just look at the governments and expect that they will be the only ones carrying this reconfiguration. But sometimes, at least from a Mexican perspective, I see the private sector and the public sector in an upside-down relationship. And I wonder, Rebecca, for example, from your US perspective, how do you see the relationship between the private sector and the government, and how that will play out for the relationship with Latin America? Thank you.
Thank you. So Mark and then Rebecca, and then we will be closing.
So I think your question is an excellent one. Certainly, I intended it much more so thinking that as a whole, as Enrique pointed out, right, the largest foreign investors are still American, European, and Western, as well as increasingly now some from the Middle East and elsewhere. But specifically on Chinese investors, I think the point that I was making was what investors want is certainty, and certainty can be provided through multiple channels. Institutions is one of those, but you're absolutely correct. They may not be the only one. And so as long as there's some certainty involving the terms and the institutions that govern the investment, that's what's necessary. And I think the Chinese investors understand, based on their own experience in China's own development, as well as in other parts of Asia with less developed rule of law, legal institutions, and so forth, that certainty can be obtained with certain types of understandings with communities, with governments, even in light of possibly changing governments in the region. So you're absolutely correct. What's important is certainty, and institutions is just one road to that. And that really does vary depending on the type of institution and also their responsibility to their shareholders. Even amongst Western firms, private investors face very different than others who face much more stringent ESG reporting and so forth. Thanks.
I'll make my answer very brief, but I think the role of the private sector is critical. And I think I would say, if we're looking, for example, at the U.S. private sector, I think today, given the private sector, I think its role in investing in the region is I think more important today than it has been in the past. And we can talk about it more afterwards. But I think I'm really glad you brought that up, because without the private sector, I think we're in a lot of trouble.
That was a great question, Rodrigo.
Yeah.
Coming from the World Economic Forum, what we do is foster public-private dialogue, and we don't see but the need to come together with practical, actionable solutions that bring governments, the private sector, and civil society together to focus on a path forward, so that we can respond to the growing challenges and the opportunities that the world is providing us. Well, it is clear that Latin America is at a strategic crossroads. The region combines vast critical minerals, environmental wealth. We have agricultural goods, renewable energy capacity, a growing tech ecosystem, and a strategic geographic location for supply chains and manufacturing. And as Tino pointed out, we have such a rich soft power through our beautiful culture. And these are no longer individual policy domains. They form a single strategic equation that will determine competitiveness, resilience, and growth for the decade ahead. And turning this potential into impact will require to rebuild trust, will require to have clear policy frameworks, deeper regional cooperation. I think Enrique mentioned collaboration, and you, Mark, mentioned integration as well. That is a must. Building more public-private compacts around very concrete outcomes. And I think also the faster deployment of infrastructure and intra-regional trade corridors, which are missing in Latin America. Tino also spoke about dreams and the contrast with today's reality in a diversity of areas. And the outlook for Latin America, I think it's promising, but only and only if leaders from all sectors act decisively to transform opportunity into that reality that we all want for our region. Thank you very much for joining us today, and a round of applause for our speakers.
We're done. I have learned a tremendous amount. Many thanks first to Marisol, to our wonderful panelists, and also to the amazing Dr. Class staff who worked so hard today to make this happen. So please, a round of applause for everybody.